Hey, what's up, everybody? We are moving on to a brand new lab here. We're going to be working on doing some measurements, and we're talking about some measurements at least, and doing some math with those measurements. So, obviously, we got a heart situated in its anatomical position in the thoracic cavity there. And if you put a stethoscope on different spots, you can hear valves closing. You can hear valves closing, okay? So depending on where you put the stethoscope, you can hear different valves closing, which is pretty neat. Now, of course, realize that when we're listening to the heart in general with the stethoscope, we're hearing two sounds. All right, there is a first heart sound, which is known as the lub. That is due to the closing of the two atrioventricular valves, so the tricuspid and the mitral valves. Then, subsequently, there is the second heart sound, the dub sound. That dub sound is due to the closing of the semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves. So we can hear those two sounds. Those two sounds happen once per heartbeat. So of course, if we're listening to somebody's heart, we can hear those sounds, hear those valves closing, and we could, of course, figure out their heart rate. Now, realize that we don't need to listen to somebody's heart. We don't need to put the stethoscope on their chest to figure out their heart rate, because heart rate is equal to pulse rate. Every time your heart beats, it sends a pressure wave through your arteries. Arteries expand. You feel that expansion as a pulse. So if we measure our pulse rate, say we put our fingers on the radial artery and we count how many times we feel that pulse in 1 minute. Let's say we get, 60 pulses per minute. That means our heart rate is 60 beats per minute. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter what artery we choose. Like any palpable artery will give us the pulse rate in a healthy person, which is equivalent to the heart rate. So we could choose the temporal artery, the facial artery, the carotid artery, the brachial artery, the radial artery, the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, the posterior tibial artery, or the dorsalis pedal artery. No matter what, doesn't matter. We're going to get that pulse rate, and we're going to know pulse rate is equal to heart rate. All right. Another measurement we can measure, besides measuring somebody's heart rate, is we can measure their blood pressure. Blood pressure is, of course, the force that is being exerted on the blood vessel wall by the enclosed blood. To do it, what we're going to do is first realize we're going to be interested in the blood pressure in this brachial artery here. So we are going to put a blood pressure cuff on it. We're going to inflate that blood pressure cuff until the pressure in the cuff is greater than the pressure in that artery. And what that'll do is that'll squeeze that artery closed. So when cuff pressure exceeds artery pressure, the artery will be closed. Then what we do is we gradually release the pressure in that cuff. And when cuff pressure drops below the highest pressure in that artery, blood will start to squirt through and we'll start to hear sounds. When we hear those sounds, we look at the pressure measurement, and that pressure measurement, when we first start to hear those sounds, is our highest blood pressure in the artery, which is known as the systolic blood pressure. So remember, we're pumping up the cuff to get the pressure above this. That shuts off the artery. Then we lower the pressure in the cuff. When it drops just below this guy, we'll hear sounds. And so we note that pressure, and that's our systolic blood pressure. Maybe it's 120, maybe it's 115, maybe it's something different. We're going to keep dropping the pressure in the cuff until the sounds disappear. When the sounds disappear, that means our cuff pressure has just gotten below diastolic. So we look at our gauge again, and whatever it's saying is going to be the lowest blood pressure or the diastolic blood pressure. So we're going to get two measurements. systolic, which is our high value, and diastolic, which is our low value. You're not going to have to like actually physically do this measurement during a lab exam, but you should understand what's going on. Like you should know when the artery is closed, when the artery is kind of squeezed and we hear sounds, and when the artery is wide open again. All right, so we got our two measurements for blood pressure, okay? And by the way, why do we hear the sounds? Well, we hear the sounds when the artery is kind of squeezed. When the artery is not squeezed, the blood flows beautifully in what's called laminar flow. But when the artery is kind of squeezed, and the artery is kind of squeezed when the pressure of the cuff is between the pressure of diastolic and systolic. So when cuff pressure is in between those two, the artery is kind of squeezed, blood flow becomes turbulent, and that's what creates the sounds that we hear. Okay. Now, if I look at a graph, with every heartbeat, my blood pressure goes up, and then it comes back down, up and back down. Don't worry about the little bump right there, okay? The high pressure is the systolic blood pressure, which is due to ventricular contraction, hence the word systolic. The low pressure is diastolic pressure, which is occurring when the heart is in diastole. Now, mathematically, what we can calculate is the strength of our pulse, and that's called our pulse pressure. Note, that is different than pulse rate. Pulse rate is the frequency of the pulse. Pulse pressure is the strength of the pulse. And I calculate pulse pressure by taking systolic and subtracting diastolic. And note, of course, all my pressure values have the same unit, which is millimeters of mercury. Okay. I can then do a little more math. I can figure out the average blood pressure. All right, I can figure out the average blood pressure. Now, it's not a straight normal average, right? You might think, okay, I got systolic and diastolic. Let me add them together and divide by 2. But that's not what we're doing. Because we spend more time in diastole, so we weigh this pressure more heavily. Our average or mean blood pressure, we take 2/3 diastolic plus 1/3 of systolic. So we weigh our diastolic pressure more heavily. It counts more because we spend more time in it. Now, mathematically, this top equation here is exactly the same as this bottom one. So I can also figure out mean blood pressure by taking diastolic and adding 1/3 of pulse pressure. You can have your teacher show you the algebra that proves that these are the same, or you can do it yourself. Or you can ask me. Doesn't matter. Anyway, we can figure out mean blood pressure, which is our average blood pressure driving blood flow. And now, let's go back to this, something you met probably in lecture, which is stroke volume. Stroke volume is the volume of blood ejected by one ventricle per beat. And our two ventricles are going to average the same stroke volume, of course. Cardiac output is the volume of blood ejected by one ventricle per minute. All right, so I can figure out cardiac output by taking my heart rate and multiplying it by my stroke volume. However, do I have stroke volume yet? Stroke volume was that volume of blood ejected by one ventricle per beat. So we're not going to measure that directly in lab, but what we're going to do is an approximation. Stroke volume is approximately given by pulse pressure times 2. So if you measure somebody's blood pressure and it was 120/90, well, then their pulse pressure would be 120 minus 90, which is 30. Then 30 times 2 would be 60. That would be our stroke volume, the units of which are milliliters per beat. And then what we could do is we could take that approximate stroke volume, multiply it by our heart rate, and get cardiac output. So let's say our heart rate was, there we go, our heart rate was 60. beats per minute. And let's say our stroke volume as calculated was 60 milliliters per beat. Beats is going to cancel out. 60 times 60 gives me 3,600 milliliters per minute. And if I wanted to, I could divide by 1,000, and that would convert milliliters into liters. And I would end up with 3.6 liters per minute as my cardiac output. All right. Now, what you guys are going to do in lab is you guys are going to take all these measurements. So heart rate, blood pressure, all right? So you get diastolic and systolic. You're then going to figure out pulse pressure, figure out stroke volume, figure out mean blood pressure, figure out cardiac output. Then what you're going to do is go hit the stairs and do some exercise. Then you're going to take all those measurements again and see what happened. Most things are going to increase. I mean, think about it. Heart rate, right? You run up and down stairs, heart rate is going to go up. Stroke volume is also going to probably go up because your heart's going to be beating faster. Not beating faster, beating stronger. Cardiac output, therefore, will go up. Systolic blood pressure will go up. Diastolic blood pressure is a little weird. It might go up a little bit. It might go down a little bit. It might stay the same. Diastolic's kind of weird. Pulse pressure, probably going to go up. Mean blood pressure, going to go up. So we're going to see whether all this happens by taking measurements before and after running up the stairs. And then we got one last little bit of math to do. Now, this looks scary. It's not that bad, okay? What we want to do is figure out how much cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume changed as a percentage of the original. The analogy I like to use is, let's say we got two guys here, all right? And each of these guys lost 30 pounds. They lost the same amount of weight, but for whom would the weight loss be more significant? Obviously, for the skinny dude, I mean, he'll look like he's dying if he lost 30 pounds. This guy, you just be like, hey, you look great. So it's not just the change that matters, it's the percent change. And to figure this out, what we do is we take our after exercise minus our before, so that's the change in cardiac output, divide it by the original, so the cardiac output before exercise, and times it by 100. So like, let's say this guy weighs 120 pounds. This guy weighs 240 pounds. Okay? If he lost 30 pounds, well, 30 divided by 120 times 100 is 25%. That's a lot of his weight. If this guy lost 30 pounds at 240, he lost 12.5% of his weight. So even though they lost the same poundage, this guy lost a greater percentage. And that's what we're figuring out here. Similarly, we just take that change in heart rate over that heart rate before exercise and multiply by 100. Lastly, same thing with stroke volume. So this is just a nice tool to see how drastic of a change it was based on where we started from. All right, a lot of math today, quick video, but a lot of math. If you don't understand any of this stuff, come to Open Lab. Let me know. Ask your instructor. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.